Claire Bennett stopped beneath the oldest apple tree on the farm and looked up. Something red was hanging from a branch that almost everyone in town had told her to cut down. The tree did not look rescued. Its trunk was split deeply through the center. Moss covered the bark. One heavy limb had died years earlier, and another leaned low enough that Claire had eventually been forced to support it. From 20 yards away, it still looked like firewood. Yet there, between a handful of tired leaves, hung a single apple. Claire reached up and twisted it carefully from the branch. The skin was rough. One side was darker than the other. There was a scar near the stem, and nothing about the fruit looked like something selected for a supermarket display. But that was not why the men standing behind Claire had gone quiet. A year earlier, they had told her this tree was finished. So was the farm around it. 70 neglected acres stretched behind a rusted gate at the edge of town. The farmhouse had been empty for years. Part of the barn roof had collapsed. Blackberry vines buried old fence lines, while young maples and locust trees had grown through fields that no longer looked like fields at all. When Claire first bought the place, nearly everyone gave her some version of the same advice. Clear it, cut it, burn what was left, start over. Even Claire had wondered whether they were right. Then she noticed something strange behind the barn. At first, the old trunks appeared scattered randomly through the brush. One crooked tree here, another farther away, a third nearly hidden by vines. But when Claire stood in exactly the right place and looked west, the trees lined up. She took several steps sideways. Another row appeared, then another. That changed everything. Because Claire was not looking at random trees that had survived in an abandoned field. She was looking at the remains of an orchard. Over the following days, she tied orange ribbon around every trunk she could identify. 23 became 40, 40 became 70. Some were hollow, some had already fallen, and many looked completely dead, but beneath the damaged bark of one neglected branch. Claire found something that made her stop. Green tissue, barely visible, still alive. That tiny strip of green created a much bigger problem than the abandoned farmhouse or broken barn ever had. If these trees had really been finished decades ago, why were they still alive? And if they were alive, what exactly had Claire just bought? Claire had not been looking for 70 acres. In fact, when she first saw the listing, she almost closed the page. The photographs were terrible. One showed a farmhouse with peeling white paint and a porch sagging toward the ground. Another showed a barn with one side of the roof caved in. The final image was little more than a wall of weeds, tangled vines, and gray tree trunks disappearing into the distance. The asking price was low, suspiciously low. That was what made her drive out to see it. The property sat several miles beyond the last gas station in town, past fields that were still being actively farmed, and houses with fresh fencing and clean driveways. By the time Claire reached the rusted gate, the road had narrowed to gravel. The real estate agent was already waiting beside his truck. He did not try very hard to sell her on the place. "The house needs work," he said. Claire looked at the missing shingles. "I can see that. The barn probably needs more." She looked at the collapsed roof. "I can see that too." He smiled. "And most of the acreage hasn't been maintained in years." That turned out to be the understatement. Behind the house, blackberry canes rose nearly to Claire's shoulders. Wild grapevine wrapped around fence posts. Young maples and locust trees had grown through areas that once looked like pasture. In several places, old wire fencing had disappeared completely beneath brush. The farther she walked, the more abandoned the farm felt, but the land was quiet. That was what she remembered most. No highway noise, no construction, only wind moving through tall grass and the occasional sound of a crow somewhere beyond the barn. Claire had spent most of her adult life working in town. She knew almost nothing about restoring an old farm. What she did know was that she wanted space. Space to grow food, space to build something of her own, space that had not already been divided, paved or polished into someone else's idea of what it should become. When she mentioned the property to people in town, the reaction was almost always the same. "That place? Why would you want that? I thought nobody had lived there in 20 years. One man at the hardware store laughed when she said she was considering buying it. "You'll spend more clearing it than the land is worth." Another told her the only practical solution was heavy equipment. Push out the brush, cut the old trees, burn the piles, start fresh. Even the real estate agent called the twisted trunks behind the barn old junk trees. Claire did not argue. At the time, she had no reason to. She signed the papers anyway, and on the morning she received the keys, she stood alone beside the rusted gate and looked across 70 acres everyone else had already decided were finished. She had no plan yet, only a strange feeling that the land had been judged too quickly. For the first few weeks, Claire treated the property like a cleanup project. She cleared a path to the barn. She cut blackberry canes away from the back porch. She dragged broken fencing into piles and marked back rotten boards she would need to replace before winter. The old trees barely registered. They were simply part of the mess. Then, one evening near sunset, Claire walked beyond the barn with a pair of pruning shears in her pocket and stopped beside one of the larger trunks. It was ugly. The bark was deeply ridged. One side had been damaged years earlier, leaving a hollow large enough to fit her hand inside. Dead vines hung from the upper branches like rope. She almost walked past it. Then she noticed another trunk directly ahead, and another beyond that. Claire stepped sideways. There was a second line. The spacing was too regular to be accidental. She stood still and looked through the brush. Once she knew what she was looking for, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Tree gap, tree gap, tree. The rows continued farther than she could see. The next morning, Claire returned with orange survey ribbon. She tied one strip around every trunk she believed belonged to the pattern. By noon, there were 23. By evening, 41. 2 days later, she had marked more than 70 old trees. Some were little more than hollow shells. Several had fallen and were slowly disappearing beneath leaves. Others were trapped beneath young maples, locusts, and thick climbing vines that had reached above their crowns and stolen most of the sunlight. But a few looked different. Claire noticed small shoots emerging from lower branches. One tree had several leaves near the top. Another had thin green growth, pushing from wood that looked completely dead from the ground. She became curious enough to test one, using the tip of her knife. She gently scratched a tiny section of bark from a narrow branch. Under the gray surface was a faint layer of green, living tissue. Claire stared at it longer than she expected. The tree was not healthy, it was not even close, but it was alive. She began clearing around that trunk by hand, not cutting the tree itself, just removing vines, blackberry canes, and some of the smaller saplings crowding its base. When she stepped back, the shape became clearer. A wide crown, low spreading branches, the structure of a tree that had once been deliberately trained for fruit. Suddenly, Claire understood what the property had been hiding. The woods behind the farmhouse were not simply woods. They had grown around something older, an orchard, a forgotten one. And if more than 70 trees were still visible after decades of neglect, Claire began to wonder how many had once been there. That night, she stood at the edge of the first cleared row while the last light faded behind the branches. For the first time since buying the farm, she was no longer thinking about what needed to be removed. She was thinking about what might still be worth saving. Claire spent the next week trying to learn what the old orchard had once been. There were no signs, no labels, no records nailed inside the barn. Only rows of aging trees disappearing into brush. She started with the farmhouse. Most of the rooms had been emptied years earlier. But one upstairs closet still held a few broken picture frames, old jars, and a cardboard box softened by moisture. At the bottom of that box, beneath a stack of yellowed receipts, Claire found a photograph. It was black and white. The edges were curled. Across the bottom, someone had written a date in faded pencil. Claire carried it downstairs and placed it beside the kitchen window. The image showed a family standing in front of the farmhouse. Behind them were rows of young fruit trees, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Claire looked out the window. The angle felt familiar. She took the photograph outside and walked toward the barn. Then she saw it. Near the right side of the old image stood a strange tree with a trunk that split low into 3 heavy limbs. Claire turned toward the orchard. Less than 50 yards away, one of the trees she had marked with orange ribbon had the same shape. 3 main limbs, the same low split, the same slight lean toward the field. For the first time, the orchard had a date attached to it. If the tree in front of her really was the same one captured in that photograph, then it had been standing there for roughly a century. Claire needed someone who might remember more. She took the photograph into town. At the hardware store, the owner studied it for a long moment before pointing toward an elderly man sitting near the front window. "You should show that to Walter Hayes." Walter was 86. He had grown up less than 2 miles from the property. When Claire placed the photograph in front of him, his expression changed. "I haven't seen that place look like this in a long time," he said. He recognized the family name. He remembered stories about wagons loaded with apples leaving the farm every fall. He remembered his father mentioning cider, and he remembered something else. "There were several kinds out there," Walter said, "not just one." Claire leaned closer. "What kinds?" Walter shook his head. "Could tell you now." Then he tapped the photograph. "But people used to come from outside the county for some of them." That sentence stayed with Claire until then. She had been trying to save old trees. Now she began to suspect she might be looking at something more valuable. Not valuable because it was perfect. Valuable because it had survived. For nearly 100 years, storms had broken branches. Vines had climbed into the crowns. Saplings had stolen the light, and the farm itself had been abandoned. Yet some of the orchard was still alive. The land had not erased its history. It had been carrying it quietly, one old tree at a time. The photograph changed the way Claire looked at the orchard. Until then, the old trees had been interesting. Now they felt important. She began spending every free hour among them. She cut away vines. She dragged fallen limbs into piles. She cleared blackberry canes from the bases of the trunks, and because she believed the trees had survived through neglect, she assumed the best thing she could do was remove everything that looked dead as quickly as possible. That was her first real mistake. One Saturday morning, Claire chose one of the largest trees near the center of the old orchard. Its crown was crowded with dead wood. Several branches crossed over one another. Others pointed straight down. The tree looked exhausted. Claire spent nearly 6 hours pruning it. One dead limb became 5, 5 became 10. By late afternoon, a huge pile of branches covered the ground. When she stepped back, the tree looked cleaner, smaller, almost younger. She was proud of it. Then the weather turned warm. Within weeks, the tree began pushing long, thin shoots straight upward from several major limbs. More appeared after that. They were fast-growing and crowded together. Unlike the stronger branches Claire had hoped to encourage, a second tree she had pruned heavily showed even less improvement. Some exposed limbs developed damaged bark where they had suddenly gone from deep shade to full sun. Claire felt sick. She had bought the farm because she wanted to save something everyone else had abandoned. Now she wondered if impatience might finish what decades of neglect had started. She stopped pruning. For several days, she did nothing. Then she began reading everything she could find about restoring old fruit trees. The message was consistent enough to make her rethink her entire approach. An old tree was not a young tree waiting to be cleaned up. Its structure had developed over decades. Its roots, canopy, stored energy, and remaining living wood had adjusted to years of stress. Removing too much at once could trigger excessive new growth, create new exposure, and force the tree to respond to another major disturbance. Claire had been treating restoration like demolition. She needed to treat it like recovery, so she changed her plan. No more aggressive cutting. No more trying to transform a century-old tree in a single season. She would work slowly. Remove obvious hazards first. Open the canopy gradually. Reduce competition around the roots. Watch how each tree responded before doing more. The orchard had survived because it had adapted slowly. Maybe it needed to be restored the same way. The next morning, Claire returned to the tree she had pruned too hard. She placed one hand against its rough trunk for the first time. She understood that saving the orchard was not going to be about forcing the trees back into production. It was going to be about learning how much they could still do on their own, and how little interference they might actually need. After nearly damaging 2 of the oldest trees by pruning too aggressively, Claire changed the way she worked. She stopped asking how quickly she could restore the orchard. Instead, she started asking why certain trees had survived at all. That question led her away from the branches and toward the ground. Claire began clearing the orchard in narrow sections. She removed blackberry canes, cut vines away from trunks, thinned only enough young growth to let light reach the remaining apple trees, and because she was no longer trying to clear everything at once, she started seeing details that had been hidden inside the brush. The first was a line of stones near the eastern side of the orchard. Claire assumed they were debris, then she followed them. The stones continued almost perfectly straight before making a sharp turn, not debris, a boundary. Several yards beyond it, she uncovered the remains of 2 wooden posts with rusted wire still attached. Farther downhill was a shallow depression running between groups of trees. It barely looked important, but after rain, the soil there stayed dark longer than the ground around it. Moss grew along the edges, leaves collected in the low area, and several apple trees beside it were noticeably stronger than trees only a short distance uphill. Claire opened her notebook. She began marking everything: slope, shade, drainage, wind exposure, areas crowded by young maples, areas where old trees still had open canopy above them. A pattern slowly emerged. The healthiest survivors were not distributed randomly. They appeared in clusters. Some stood near the darker soil. Others remained in places where competing trees had never completely closed the canopy. That did not mean Claire understood why every tree had survived, but it suggested something important. The orchard had not survived through luck alone. Parts of the landscape had protected it. Then Claire found another clue. While clearing leaves near one trunk, her rake struck metal. She reached down and pulled out a thin, badly corroded tag. Most of the surface was unreadable. A few stamped characters remained, but not enough to identify the tree. Claire turned the tag over in her hand. Someone had once tracked this tree individually. The photograph from 1924 had already shown her that the orchard was old. The rows proved it had been planted deliberately, but the tag, fences, stone lines, and drainage patterns suggested something larger. This had once been a working system. The orchard had lanes, boundaries, Individual trees worth recording, places designed to move water, places designed to move people. Years of abandonment had buried those instructions beneath leaves, roots and brush, but they were still there. Claire finally understood why clearing the farm too quickly would have been dangerous. A bulldozer could have removed the mess. It could also have erased the evidence. So instead of trying to make the property look new, Claire began learning how to read what remained. And by the end of winter, she was about to find out whether the old trees had been reading the same landscape all along. Winter changed the orchard again. By January, the rows Claire had uncovered were easier to see. Without leaves, the old trees looked even more fragile, their branches twisted against the pale sky. Some trunks were hollow. Others leaned at angles that made Claire wonder how they had survived so many storms. For months, she had been working without knowing whether any of it would matter. She had cleared competing brush. She had opened small pockets of light. She had stopped cutting aggressively. She had learned to watch instead of forcing results. But the trees gave her no guarantees. That uncertainty followed her through the winter. Then March arrived. The first warm days softened the ground, and Claire began walking the orchard every morning before breakfast. At first, nothing changed. Gray bark, bare limbs, cold wind. Then, on a tree near the old stone boundary, she saw something, a swelling on one of the smaller branches. Claire stepped closer. At the tip of a short spur, a tiny green point had pushed through. She stared at it. Then she checked the next branch, another bud and another. The tree was waking up, not dramatically. Not all at once, but undeniably. Claire took out her phone and photographed the first bud from 3 different angles. By the end of the week, she found green growth on 6 more trees. The pattern surprised her. The strongest response came from trees where she had done the least, where she had simply cleared vines, reduced competition, and allowed more light to reach the canopy. That realization changed her again. She had spent months thinking restoration meant doing more. Now, she was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important work was removing what prevented a living system from responding. The orchard did not need to be rebuilt from nothing. Parts of it were already trying to come back. One afternoon, Walter Hayes drove out to see the farm. Claire led him toward the eastern rows. He moved slowly, using a cane, stopping every few yards to study the trees. When they reached the first one with visible buds, Claire pointed upward. Walter looked for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. Claire laughed. It was the first time someone from town had looked at the orchard without pity. Word spread not quickly, just enough. A neighbor stopped by, then another. People who had once called the trees useless began asking questions. "How many are alive? Will they fruit? Do you know what kind they are?" Claire had no answers yet. That was what made the moment powerful. The buds were not proof of a harvest. They were proof of possibility. After decades of neglect, the old orchard had responded to the smallest change in its environment. Light, space, time. Claire walked the rows that evening and counted every tree showing green. 14, then 17, then 21. The number mattered less than what it represented. For the first time since buying the property, she had evidence that the farm was not simply a ruin she had chosen to rescue. It was still alive, and spring had just begun. The green buds had proved that some of the old trees were alive. They had not proved the orchard could produce fruit. Claire knew the difference. By early April, leaves were opening across several of the rows she had cleared. She began carrying a notebook on her morning walks. Tree 7 showed strong growth. Tree 12 remained weak on one side. Tree 18 had several swollen spurs that looked different from the ordinary leaf buds. Claire tried not to attach meaning to them. Then one morning she found a pale pink bud near the center of tree 18. She checked it twice. The following day, it opened. 5 small petals, white along the edges, pink near the center. One flower, that was all. But Claire understood what it meant. The tree was doing more than surviving. It was attempting to reproduce. Within days, 2 more trees flowered, then several more. Branches that had looked almost dead through winter began holding scattered patches of white and pink. Some produced only 3 or 4 blossoms. Others surprised Claire with entire clusters. Nothing happened evenly, and that worried her. Because flowers were fragile, one cold night could undo weeks of progress. The warning came almost immediately. The forecast dropped. Claire watched the temperature fall after sunset and knew there was almost nothing she could realistically do for dozens of century-old trees spread across an abandoned orchard. By morning, several blossoms on the exposed edges had browned. Others had fallen. Claire walked the rows slowly. For the first time since the buds appeared, the orchard felt vulnerable again. Some flowers were gone, but not all of them. Trees in more sheltered sections still held blossoms. So did those near the lower ground Claire had been mapping. The same subtle differences that appeared to have helped the trees survive decades of neglect were now shaping how they responded to spring weather. Claire recorded everything. Then came another question. Even surviving blossoms would mean little without pollination. For several mornings she saw almost no activity. The orchard looked alive, but strangely still. Then, during a warmer afternoon, Claire heard something above her. A low vibration. She looked toward the blossoms. Bees. At first there were only a few. Then she noticed them across several trees. Moving from flower to flower, Claire stood beneath the branches and listened. She did not know how many blossoms would hold. She did not know whether the aging trees had enough strength to carry fruit through summer. And she certainly did not know whether the apples would be worth eating. But the orchard had now crossed another line. First there had been living wood, then buds, now flowers. For decades, everyone had assumed the trees were waiting to die. Instead, they were trying to make apples. The blossoms did not all survive. Some were lost to the cold. Others disappeared in wind and rain. Several trees flowered heavily but produced almost nothing afterward. Claire expected disappointment. What she did not expect was how different the surviving fruit would become. By early summer, tiny green apples appeared on several trees. Some were no larger than marbles. Weeks later, the differences began to show. One tree carried small yellow fruit. Another produced apples with dark red skin. Others developed stripes, irregular shapes, or rough surfaces that looked nothing like the uniform fruit Claire was used to seeing in grocery stores. She resisted the obvious conclusion. Different did not automatically mean rare. Old did not automatically mean valuable, and an unusual-looking apple did not mean she had discovered some forgotten cultivar. Still, Claire wanted to know what she had. She took several samples to Walter Hayes. Walter turned the first apple slowly in his hand. He smelled it, then took a bite. His expression changed before he said anything. He remembered the flavor, not the name. His mother, he told Claire, had used something similar for sauce. That distinction mattered. Memory could tell Claire that an apple felt familiar. It could not reliably identify a century-old tree, so she began asking other longtime residents. The answers created more clues, but not certainty. One woman remembered apples that remained firm deep into winter. Another remembered tart fruit being used for cider. A man recalled trees near the barn producing apples earlier than the rest. Nobody could confidently connect those memories to a named variety. Claire stopped trying to force an answer. Instead, she gave the trees numbers. Tree 14, tree 27, tree 33. She photographed each fruit, recorded color, texture, harvest date, flavor. Growth habit. She documented the trees as they actually existed, rather than turning uncertain memories into facts. That careful approach produced an unexpected result. People became more interested, not less. The apples did not need dramatic names. They were interesting because they were different from one another. A local baker preferred one softer variety for sauce and pies. A cider maker was curious about several sharper apples. Other visitors simply wanted to taste fruit from trees that had been standing long before many modern orchards around town existed. But Claire was thinking beyond that season. The old trunks would not survive forever. Some were hollow, some were already failing. Saving the orchard could not mean depending on every original tree remaining alive. Then she began learning about grafting. A healthy piece of living wood from an aging tree could potentially be carried forward onto younger rootstock. That changed the question completely. Claire no longer needed to ask whether she could keep every century-old trunk alive forever. She needed to decide which living material was worth carrying into the next generation. And suddenly the oldest trees on the farm were no longer simply producing apples, they were producing options. By September, the orchard had produced enough fruit to answer one important question. The trees could still make apples. That did not make Claire a commercial orchardist. Some trees carried only a handful of fruit. Several produced nothing. Others had fruit that was too damaged or inconsistent to sell. But among the survivors, Claire had enough usable apples to begin experimenting. She started with a folding table beside the barn, no expensive farm stand, no polished branding, just baskets. Each basket carried the number of the tree that produced the fruit. Tree 14, tree 27, tree 33. Claire refused to invent names or claim the apples were rare. She simply cut samples and let people taste them. The reactions taught her more than she expected. Some apples were unpleasantly sharp when eaten fresh. The cider maker loved them. Another variety softened too quickly for storage. A local baker immediately wanted more because the flesh cooked down beautifully. Several sweeter apples disappeared first. People began comparing them, returning for favorites, asking which tree produced which flavor. The important change was not the amount of fruit Claire sold. It was that different apples had different uses. For the first time, the orchard's irregularity became an advantage instead of a weakness. Still, Claire kept the operation small. She did not have enough dependable production to promise large orders. She did not know what the following year would bring. And she had already learned what happened when she tried to push old trees too hard. So rather than scaling quickly, she built around what the orchard could reliably provide: a few boxes for the baker, several sharper batches for cider, small weekend picking sessions, apple butter, fresh cider when enough fruit was available, and perhaps most important, the first young grafted trees propagated from several healthier old specimens. Visitors became interested in more than buying apples. They wanted to walk through the orchard. They wanted to see the tree that appeared in the 1924 photograph. They wanted to compare fruit from trees with different numbers. They wanted to understand how a place that looked like woodland only a year earlier had been hiding an orchard. That interest finally began producing modest income, not enough to make Claire rich. Not even close, but enough to matter. A section of fencing could be replaced. Part of the barn roof could be repaired. Tools could be purchased without every expense feeling like money disappearing into abandoned land. The reversal was quiet. When Claire first bought the property, people had told her the old trees were reducing the value of the land. Now those same trees were beginning to pay for their own preservation. Claire stood beneath tree 27. One evening after the last visitors had left, she had not made the farm valuable. By replacing what was there, she had simply discovered that something valuable had been hidden inside what everyone wanted removed. And once other people could see it too, the 70 acres began changing in a way she had never planned. By October, Claire noticed something different at the rusted gate: cars. A year earlier, people slowed near the property, mostly to look at the abandoned farmhouse or collapsed barn. Now they were turning into the driveway. Some came for apples, others came because somebody had told them about the old orchard. But a surprising number arrived carrying memories. Walter visited often. As Claire cleared more of the old lanes, he began recognizing pieces of the farm that had disappeared beneath decades of growth. There had been a wagon route near one row. Crates had once been stored near the barn. Another section of trees had continued farther south. Walter never remembered everything perfectly. And Claire did not treat every recollection as fact, but the stories helped connect physical clues she had already found. Then other people began contributing their own fragments. One afternoon, an elderly woman stopped beneath tree 14. She held one of its yellow apples for several seconds without eating it. Claire walked over. The woman explained that her father used to bring similar apples home when she was a child. She was careful. She could not prove it was the same variety. She could not remember a name, but the smell was familiar. Then she took a bite, her eyes filled with tears. Claire said nothing. She finally understood that restoring the orchard had produced something she had never included in her plans. The trees were not only producing fruit, they were giving people access to pieces of their own past. That realization changed the atmosphere around the farm. The neighbor who had once advised Claire to clear everything arrived one morning pulling a trailer. Old fence posts were stacked inside. He told her she might be able to use them. Claire reminded him of what he had said when she first bought the place. He looked toward the orchard, then admitted quietly that he might have been wrong. There was no dramatic apology, no meeting where the town officially changed its mind. The reversal happened through smaller things. A pickup parked near the barn. A baker returned for another box. A child carried an apple down a row. Walter pointed toward a lane no one had seen in decades. Someone brought posts. Someone else remembered a harvest. The farm came back into the life of the town one person at a time. By late afternoon on one of the final weekends of the season, Claire stood near the gate, watching the last visitors leave. Behind her were the same twisted trunks people once wanted removed. They had not become younger. They had not become perfect. But people now photographed them, walked beneath them, bought their fruit, told stories about them. Claire had spent a year believing she was changing the orchard. Only now did she recognize the larger reversal. The trees had changed almost everyone who looked at them. After the final apples were picked, the farm became quiet again. The folding table disappeared from beside the barn. The cider was gone. The visitors stopped coming. Cold November air moved through the branches. Claire walked the orchard alone. Nearly a year had passed since she tied the first orange ribbons around the trunks. Some ribbons were faded. Others had torn loose. The trees beneath them still looked old. That had never changed. One trunk remained split through the center. Another contained a hollow large enough to fit Claire's arm inside. Several major limbs needed support, and no amount of careful restoration would ever make these trees resemble a young commercial orchard. Some had not survived at all. A few never leafed out. One broke during a storm. Others simply had too little living wood remaining. Claire no longer considered those trees evidence that the restoration had failed. She had finally understood something she had missed when she bought the property. Saving an old orchard did not mean saving every tree. It meant recognizing what was still alive before it disappeared. She continued walking. Near the edge of the orchard stood several young grafted trees. They looked almost insignificant beside the century-old trunks. Thin stems, small crowns, protective guards around their bases, yet each carried living material taken from one of the surviving trees. Claire stopped there. That was the future of the orchard. Not freezing the farm in time, not pretending old trees could live forever, passing something forward, behind the grafts. Part of the barn roof had been repaired. New fencing crossed one section of the property. Beyond it were rows Claire had barely begun clearing. More brush, more trunks, more questions. A year earlier, Claire would have looked at that unfinished work and felt pressure to move faster. Now she did not. The farm had already taught her what rushing could destroy. Old land revealed itself slowly. Patterns appeared only after vines were removed. Boundaries emerged beneath leaves. Living wood hid beneath gray bark. Memories survived without names. Claire returned to tree 27. She placed one hand against the rough trunk. When she first arrived, nearly everyone saw 70 abandoned acres. Claire had almost seen the same thing. But the farm had never really been empty. Its rows were still there. Its roots were still there. Parts of its history were still alive. What had disappeared was attention. Claire looked down the old orchard lane as the afternoon light moved through the branches. For decades, the trees had been treated as if their story were already over. They had not been waiting for someone to replace them. They had been waiting for someone to notice. Old did not mean useless. Abandoned did not mean gone.